still under oath, Doctor.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you. Yes,
Well, Doctor, yesterday we dealt with your report and we focused on the fact that your diagnosis may be seen as a mental illness for purposes of the Act and reference. Today we're doing something different. We'll get back to that, but I'm just dealing with the report and the diagnosis as you've made it.
I don't have the exhibit in front of me, my lady.
I will make sure we get it. And by exhibit you mean your report?
I do have a copy, but I don't have the marked exhibit.
If you have a copy, you're welcome to refer to your copy. We will make the marked exhibit available, but if you have a copy, that's exactly the same. Thank you. Doctor, the diagnosis, GAD, that is a diagnosis that span over his functioning in general.
Yes.
One would expect, and that's one of the criteria I've quickly gleaned from the DSM-5, that there would be impairment of his functioning on various levels in his life.
Yes, my lady, that's why it's called a disorder. By saying disorder, it implies there's an impairment of social and occupational functioning.
Yeah. So one would, that you just said it, social, work, sport, family, on all those levels, one would expect that.
Yes.
Now, the fact that one is anxious in your social life or at work or sport, that is expected from lots of people. Lots of people are anxious in their workplace.
Anxiety is a very common phenomena, and in addition, generalized anxiety disorder is also not an uncommon disorder.
But to raise it to the level of a disorder, one expects something more than what's common. Am I right?
Yeah, yes, that's correct.
What would that be?
So to raise it to a level of a disorder, one has to have anxiety more often than not for an extended period of time. The issues about what one is anxious become out of proportion to what they really are. So in other words, the individual sees situations in a light, a more serious light than they actually are. And the reaction to the anxiety is associated with various symptoms that would be things like a sleep disorder, an appetite disorder, vomiting, nausea, diarrhea, sweating, inability to concentrate, and distractibility, perhaps an irritability. So there are a whole host of symptoms that are ongoing in an anxiety disorder. And so, yes, everybody has something they worry about, and these worries, they can be distracted from them when something else happens. But people with an anxiety disorder are unable to set their worries aside, and they think about them constantly. And that is why perhaps the term worry have features of anxiety more often than not on most days becomes important. And then the DSM does mention a period of 6 months. I think the 6 months is not important as what it is. It's a pervasive anxiety.
Would there be levels of GAD, that less severe, more severe, and things like that?
Well, with every disorder there are levels of severity. It's not particularly contained within the diagnosis, so you either have the diagnosis or not, but with any diagnosis it can be mild or severe.
Now, the GAD, if it's severe enough and it impacts the person in a very severe manner, that could be seen as a mental illness.
I wouldn't say that, my lady. I would say if one has a generalized anxiety disorder that is severe, it may impact on your capacity to live a normal lifestyle. By definition, generalized anxiety disorder is a psychiatric diagnosis, so one can say it is a mental illness. But one has to look at the impact of that diagnosis on the individual's capacity to live and socialize. So a person with a very severe generalized anxiety disorder might become incapacitated to leave their house and get to work on time because they have to have so much preparation to get on with their day. And they may have to start getting up earlier and earlier and earlier in order to get all their preparations done in order to be ready enough to go to work. They might start skipping days of work because they feel they're just unable to cope. So I hope that explains the condition better, my lady.
In this particular instance, there's no evidence that the accused was incapacitated to that extent.
No, he was still able to function at a high level as an athlete, and he still did socialize. He had distress because of his anxiety disorder, but he was at that stage still able to continue with his life.
But it remained your evidence yesterday that the general anxiety disorder is relevant to his actions on the morning of 14 February, on his version.
It may be relevant on his version. That is correct, my lady. And that would be for the court to find.
What is interesting, though, Dr. Vorster, is that we've had evidence from friends and a former girlfriend, and none of the witnesses indicated any indications of an anxious person or of anxiety by the accused.
People with a generalized anxiety disorder, or even just anxious people, conceal their anxiety. And so anxiety is very common. And most people control and conceal their anxiety. I would also add, my lady, that Mr. Pistorius and his family were not aware that he had generalized anxiety disorder. So it would not be something they would have mentioned.
I'm not talking about mentioning the specific disorder. I'm just mentioning that there was no evidence that he's anxious in his social interaction with his friends and or girlfriend. That never came out.
It certainly came up in the collateral information that I obtained, my lady.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. The collateral information you obtained are all from people linked to the accused himself in terms of family and coaches and so forth.
Yes.
And whilst I'm dealing with that, you referred to 3 statements that you received. It was the statements of De Waarheid, Schrijvenstein and Binge. You received them from the defense team, I'm sure.
That's correct.
Are those the only statements that you had opportunity to peruse?
Yes.
let us just then see. The accused was, I think, if I understand your report correct, the accused was anxious about crime as well.
Yes, he was.
And that's one of the factors you took into account in your diagnosis, that he was severely anxious about crime in South Africa.
Yes.
And I think you said that he took excessive security measures.
Yes.
What would that be?
After his burglary at his townhouse, he increased his security measures there and then moved to a housing estate where he would be more, perhaps he thought he would be more secure because of the security guards available at the perimeters. But after he found out that there had been some burglaries there, he became more concerned that even that housing estate wouldn't be sufficiently secure. So in addition to the security measures of the perimeter security, he also had dogs, beams around his house, a burglar alarm in his house, and he would then lock himself in his bedroom at night.
Now,
and
yeah.
He informed me that he intended to move from that housing estate because he no longer felt safe and was in the process of purchasing a house in Johannesburg where he wanted to have a gatehouse, a type of a gate entry where one gate would close before the other one opened, increased security measures in that house. And I felt that his security measures were more than that taken by the average South African.
But why would you say that, Doctor, measured against what?
Just against my own perception of people's security measures.
But certainly, Doctor, would you agree with me that most people have burglar alarms?
Yes.
In South Africa, most people have dogs.
Most people have dogs.
Most people have burglar alarms. Most
Yes.
people have lots of people have beams in the perimeter fences. Why would you say that it's, as far as he's concerned, exceptional?
Because most people don't also lock themselves in their bedroom at night.
You see,
That makes them rather restricted in their movements in their house.
that is interesting. So, because we had evidence by next door neighbours that did the same thing, but what I'm getting at is, why would you make that finding and relate it to most people in South Africa? Does that not show a level of impartiality towards the accused? Because in my view, that's quite common, the security measures.
I don't believe it shows a level of bias towards the accused. This was my opinion as far as his level of security. And, my lady, what I was looking for was to evaluate whether he was in fact paranoid about the possible threat to himself. So that is why I was asking him questions about the security measures that he took. So I didn't find that he was paranoid, but I thought that his concerns about his personal safety in South Africa were more than that of the average South African. Of course, I'm not a security consultant in any way, but just from being a South African myself, that was my opinion.
Doctor, I've now heard your answer, but the mere fact of people locking them into their rooms, are you really saying that it's extraordinary? Isn't that just ordinary?
No,
people lock themselves in?
I think that's taking security a step further.
You see, by having said that, brings me to the next question. If we have a person that suffers from GAD, that was diagnosed with GAD, would that person not take steps to secure the rest of his house so that nobody could gain entry into his house, and be very concerned about people getting entry into his house. You would expect that, isn't it?
Yes, I'd expect that.
See, what we have in this instance is well, firstly, there were no burglar proofing in the house, but it's not he's doing, in terms of the estate, they weren't allowed to do that.
As I understand,
Yeah.
it was their state rules.
No, I've no problem with that. I just wanted to tell you that. But there was a broken window downstairs on a window with no burglar proofing. And the accused wasn't overly anxious to have that fixed. It was there for days. That would be strange, isn't it?
No, I don't think so. If you already have no burglar bars, you have to be reliant on your beams and your passive sensors. So whether you have a broken window or not is not as important as it would be if it was a window that had burglar bars.
No, that is from the perspective of a normal person. We're dealing here with a person diagnosed with GAD, general anxiety disorder. Now, a person suffering from GAD would certainly take care that he fixes that window immediately, because he's suffering from a disorder.
One would certainly expect that such an individual wouldn't leave a broken window for a prolonged time period, no.
Yes.
But I don't think that would mean that if it would happen during the day, they would find that they would have it fixed, let's say, that same day.
We're talking about a prolonged period. And you gave the answer. You would have expected something different from... then the other issues, and we're just dealing with a person suffering from GAD, the accused. He allowed ladders to be in his premises. Now, suffering from GAD and be anxious about crime, one wouldn't expect him to allow that.
No, one would expect the ladders to be locked up or secured.
Yes. But so we have two instances. We have a broken window, we have ladders outside not locked up and secured, which one wouldn't expect from a person suffering from GAD.
One wouldn't expect ladders available, easily available, no.
Now, then also linked to your evidence and the security measures, we have, you wouldn't expect a person suffering from GAD not to be concerned if his alarm system is working or not.
No, they would be concerned that it would work.
Very concerned.
Yes.
Yeah, you see, what we have in this instance is that the accused wasn't concerned. He said they worked on it, they didn't really know if it worked or not. That is also a factor that you found strange.
My lady, I'm sitting back listening to a number of statements which I can of course correct, and I don't want to lead evidence now, but I will come back to the re-examination. But just to say that he was not concerned about the alarm system, he spoke about the beams that could have been taken off in the painting, not the total alarm system. He was not concerned about that. It was one part of it. So I'm listening to questions being put as an absolute and generalized, and it's just not a true reflection of the evidence. It's some of the beams where they painted on the outside, not the alarm system in general.
Thank you, Mr. Nel.
The record will speak for itself. That's where it ended. It ended with the beams, but it started earlier with the alarm system.
Yes. Perhaps if you are more specific, what was wrong with the alarm system? If you just be more specific, it might avoid this.
May I ask another question? It will be a general question, but if the board will allow me. A person suffering from GAD would ensure that his alarm system is functioning properly.
Yes.
Yes. then, again, and I'm repeating myself because I just want to make it clear, we're dealing with somebody that suffers from GAD and that's anxious about crime in particular. That person will not be able to go to sleep with the balcony door open and not secured and locked.
I can't answer yes there because it would depend who they were living with. So if they were living alone, then it would be up to them to be responsible for ensuring that the house was locked and closed, and then they would then be able to go to sleep. But if they were living with some other person, then it would depend on that person's needs and comforts as well. So the answer would be a conditional yes.
I take your conditional yes, but can I just ask you a follow-up question? You see, we're not dealing with an anxious person, because an anxious person would trust my partner to close the door. We're dealing with a person that's been diagnosed with GAD. So the anxiousness, anxiety is on a high level. Now that person would close the door himself.
No, not necessarily. Not in a relationship, no.
Even so, but then that goes towards a level of GAD, isn't it? Because if it's severe level of GAD, he would close it himself. Less severe, why would he trust somebody else if he's overly anxious?
Because people with generalized anxiety disorders have relationships just like other people, and so they would be concerned about their partner's comfort as well. So if it was a hot day or night, they would trust that their partner would close doors and windows and not be reliant on themselves to do that closing.
Yeah, you see, rely on themselves, and this is the last question I'm asking because you gave us a qualified yes. It's not so much trust your partner to do it. It's because I suffer from GAD. The fact that that door's open would make me so anxious that I wouldn't be able to sleep. I will stay awake and my partner would be comfortable, but I would be able to sleep. Isn't that an issue?
It could be an issue.
Yeah. In all probability, a person from GAD would act in that way.
No.
Why?
It could be an issue. It's not a probability, it's a possibility.
Good. Doctor, could we then deal with your you see, if I'm suffering from GAD, do you know about the incident on the way back from the Vaal where the accused and his friends were stopped by a traffic police officer?
I would have to be asked specific questions.
Let me deal with that. What we have is we have a person suffering from GAD. GAD would affect all spheres of his life. And before I get there, can I just ask you, you see, am I right in saying that one would expect a person suffering from GAD to be anxious because of unprovoked factors? You just become anxious. One wouldn't always expect a trigger for such a person to be anxious.
No, people with generalized anxiety disorders have high levels of free-floating anxiety. So they're anxious all the time, and if you had a trigger, you'd need a smaller trigger to react to that anxiety than other people, perhaps.
Oh. Now, if the facts are roughly that the accused and his friends were traveling on the highway, they were speeding, and they were stopped by the traffic police. And so there was some kind of disagreement between one of the traffic officers and the driver of the car, which is not the accused. Now, a person suffering from GAD, this will make him very anxious.
Yes, because they would feel that they would maybe get into trouble.
Yeah.
So, yes.
And that would really affect everything he does then, because he's worried that he would get into trouble. Am I right?
Well, I don't know that it would affect
But what
everything
will
he does. He will be anxious, and then his levels of anxiety will be higher. So let's say they were driving along in a speeding car, and they were stopped. One would expect the levels of anxiety to be increased compared to then before they were stopped.
But that is true for every person.
Yes,
If I'm driving in a car and the traffic, I mean, what happens is you get anxious.
Yes, that's true. For
But-
any person, it's correct.
But what I'm getting at, if somebody is suffering from GAD, one would expect something else, something more. Because I'm not going to use myself, because you might say things that I don't want to, but the person that are not suffering from GAD and a person suffering from GAD would act differently.
Not necessarily, because if you are placed in a situation of anxiety, anxiety is, say, a general. Anxiety is something that most people experience. So it's something that's not uncommon to people to have episodes where they're anxious.
Okay, so I see. So if a normal person in the situation of a person suffering with GAD, they could both be equally anxious. So let's use this. So if I'm anxious and I'm not suffering from GAD, and a GAD sufferer is anxious, it's the same thing.
No.
What then?
So if you've got two passengers in a car, and the one has a GAD and the other one doesn't, and then they get stopped for speeding, because the individual with the general anxiety disorder is already primed with increased levels of anxiety, they will be more distressed by being stopped than the passenger who doesn't have the disorder. So there will be distress in both passengers, but one would expect increased distress in the already ill, shall we say. Not a good term, perhaps, but already disordered person.
I liked ill, but I know, but that was just.
The general anxiety disorder, my lady, is very common. So it can range between 1% and 6% of the general population. So
would suffer from GAD.
yes, so in a room like this, you'll find several people with general anxiety disorder, and they live their lives and they cope, and you can look at them and not see it. So it's not an uncommon disorder.
I see. Yeah, we'll get to that, because it was clear in going through the accused's life and how he grew up that he in fact coped with the stresses of life in growing up.
He did. Might have been at a cost to himself, but he did cope.
He coped, and he did well at school, he did well at sport, and so he coped.
He did.
Dr. Kidd, as far as your report is concerned, you yesterday indicated that you dealt with two issues.
Yes.
One is the merits of the matter, and one is sentence.
No. Not quite.
Okay, what did you then say?
I said that this report could be viewed by the court in the merit or for sentencing. So the factors that are contained in the report are factors that could be available for either aspect, and it would be up to the court to decide on the usefulness or otherwise of the report.
So when you drafted this report, and was the intention also that this report could be used for sentences purposes?
If required, yes.
And would that explain why you mentioned the depression after the incident, his remorsefulness, and so forth?
No. The depression after the incident is simply as part of his current mental state. So since the incident, he has developed a depressive disorder and he is being treated for that depressive disorder. And so when he's evaluated, that depressive disorder is apparent. I don't know that that would necessarily be a factor if he were to be sentenced or not.
So your intention in, when you drafted the report and gave the evidence, what factors would then be more in line with sentence process? The remorse and the guilt feelings?
No, the generalized anxiety disorder and the vulnerability.
For sentence?
For sentence.
But the same things would apply, if I read your report correctly, for merit as well?
It could, depending on what facts of the case the court accepts.
Now, so if you say Dr. Holmes, you had access to, I don't know if it's Dr. Holmes.
Dr. Holmes, yes.
Dr. Holmes, you had access to his report.
Yes.
I've just checked quickly in the time I had available. He's registered as a educational and industrial psychologist.
Yes, that's correct.
Not a clinical psychologist.
No, he's not clinical.
What was the purpose of his report?
I don't know.
What did you glean from it? Well, how did it assist you?
It contained the history as what obtained by Dr. Holmes. He also had a clinical psychologist who did testing on the accused. And it confirmed the history as I had obtained, and also the test results contained in the report confirmed the impression I had gained of the accused. So it was another document I had available to me.
So you relied on the clinical psychologist's results?
I didn't rely on them as such. It was just useful information.
Yeah. But I'm driving towards if we should have a look at it. Did it play a role in your report, the clinical psychologist's results?
No, it was just another source of information. I didn't analyze the report or look at it in great detail. That would be the role of the psychologist to do, not for me.
Yeah. So, and Dr. Holmes' report, if I understand you correctly, you used more for purposes of the history and confirming what you had about the history growing up of the accused and so forth.
Yes, and the clinical test results confirmed my opinion. So I didn't use it as such, but it was collateral information for me.
The purpose of his report, was it forensic or therapeutic? Dr. Holmes' report.
I think it was forensic.
I think it was forensic. Now, in your report, you've based your conclusions and or recommendations on the accused version.
Yes, that's correct.
You did not take into account any other version, the state's version.
No, I did not have that.
Do you think that's impartial?
No, it's simply saying what I said in my report is that is what the accused has told to me, and it would be up to the court to make the decision as to whether that was a reasonably possible version. So I've made it clear that it's based on this version and the court must decide on the facts of the case. My asking of the version of the offence was not to come to the truth, but rather to look at the accused's mental state at the time of the offence.
So, I have that. His mental state at the time of the offence. I'm sure you will agree with me, but let's just go with it. To really evaluate the accused's mental state at the time of the offence, and if that's the purpose of your report, would that not have been better to have all versions before you?
It would be an advantage to have all versions, but at the same time, I still would not be able to say which version the court would accept.
And I understand that, but for an expert, and I'm not challenging your expertise, but for an expert, one would expect to want to look at the accused version, any other versions, before I make a finding of the accused's mental state at the time of the offence.
I can certainly be provided with alternative versions and can comment on them to the court today. Be happy to do that, but all I had available to me at the time was the accused version.
Did you ask for any other version, or from the? And it's not, you didn't, because if you did, you would have given it. You never asked for a version from the state, what the state's version.
I was given a transcript of the accused's evidence in court, but I didn't go through it because, again, it's not necessarily the version that the court will accept.
The different versions, would that not have affected your diagnosis, the state's version? Well, your diagnosis that or your view that GAD played a role during the commission of the offence?
No, it wouldn't have made a difference. So the diagnosis stays a constant, and it played a role at the time of the offence, and that would be regardless of which version the court accepts. So it's what I'm trying to bring out in my report is to show that the two factors that are constant are the generalized anxiety disorder and the vulnerability. Then it would be for the court to say what the facts are and how this would then fit into that.
You've invited a version, and let me just give you a version. If the court finds that the accused knew that the deceased was in the toilet and he fired to kill the deceased, would GAD play a role?
Yes, it could.
Could, why, how?
Because an individual with generalized anxiety disorder would be anxious about losing a relationship.
So you then presuppose that there would have been an argument about a relationship.
If there had been an argument about a relationship, a person with a generalized anxiety disorder would have increased levels of anxiety, yes.
But if he is anxious about the relationship and he walks to a door and fires 4 shots with the intention to kill the deceased in this matter, how would GAD play a role? In the build-up there too?
In the build-up then, yes.
But not in the firing of the shots?
No, not at all.
So in the build-up, GAD could play a role, but then in any argument, the emotions, and all people get anxious during arguments.
Yes, all people get anxious and upset in arguments, that's correct. That's the nature of an argument, it's an emotional event.
The fact that let me rather ask the question first. If I read your report correctly, you said the court should take into account your diagnosis of GAD and the accused's physical vulnerability in coming to a conclusion.
That is correct, Your Ladyship.
Now, you knew that he shot and killed the deceased when you interviewed the accused.
Yes, that's correct.
You knew that, you anticipated that this report may have been used for purpose of sentencing as well.
Yes.
Now, the fact that a firearm was used and somebody killed, and that person suffering from GAD is a danger, why was that not included in your report?
People suffering from generalized anxiety disorders are not dangerous as such, Your Ladyship. People with generalized anxiety disorders probably shouldn't have firearms. That creates the element of the dangerousness. So where you have so many people in the general population with generalized anxiety disorder, they're not a threat to the general population as such. So the diagnosis as such is not one that one would associate it with violent behavior or threat.
No.
So where one has added to that a firearm, that makes that person at risk of being involved in violent activities. And it is so, Your Ladyship, that unfortunately people who are anxious about their personal security are the very ones who are more likely to want to purchase a firearm. And that is unfortunately the situation.
Now, what we have in this instance is we have the accused saying that he was a gun enthusiast. Do you know that he bought more guns during 2012?
Yes, he said it was his hobby to collect guns.
So it wasn't only for his own safety?
No.
Now, the factors mentioned in your report, in the fact that the accused, your view is that his GAD started at the age of 11. 11 months. Yeah. You've never consulted the father?
No, I didn't consult the father, that's correct.
But being able to take it back that far, don't you think that the father, being the only biological parent available, should be able to give you lots of valuable information?
It would have been advantageous to see the father, yes.
And what I also pick up is that at page 2 of your report, the accused attended creche and there were no apparent problems, so he coped.
He coped, yes.
But he couldn't have suppressed his anxiety disorder then, because children cannot suppress their anxiety disorders, they just cope or not.
Yes, it's harder to diagnose anxiety disorders in children of that age.
But okay, and you know why I'm asking it, because that is your finding. Your finding is he suffered from GAD from the age 11, from 11 months, and it's getting progressively worse. So I'm going to go through this. He cannot suppress it at 17 months. If he was suffering from GAD at 17 months, everybody would pick it up.
No, the point to be made is these are the factors that would have contributed to the development of his general anxiety disorders. So that started at 11 months. So that would be a factor contributing to that development.
So
what I'm trying to show the court, my lady, is the early onset of factors that would have contributed.
Yeah, but then What I find interesting, Dr. Vorster, is if you say it started at 11 months and at 17 months he was coping well, why would you do that? Because why would you say that at 17 months it has already started?
Because there's no doubt that children who have bilateral amputations at the age of 11 months see that as a very stressful situation, and that their development is different to children who don't have such similar amputations.
And I don't doubt it. I'm sure it would be different. But this is more specific. You made a finding, Doctor, that he suffered even at that early age from anxiety disorder.
I'm saying in my report that that would be a factor that contributed to the development of his generalized anxiety disorder.
So then well, we dealt with that. At 17 months, he was fitted prosthetic legs. He went to the creche and he functioned at the creche.
He was always encouraged to be as normal as possible.
And he coped well at school.
Coped well at school. He was able to pass every year, and he competed in sport, and he had friends.
He was sociable, he was good at sport, he played tennis, rugby, went jogging, had no problems with his academic performance.
That is correct.
Why would that have contributed to his anxiety disorder? Because you're not saying that at 14 he was suffering from anxiety disorder.
He may well have been suffering from an anxiety disorder at the age of 14.
He wouldn't be able to suppress it at that age.
Yes, he would have been able to, because his family constantly encouraged him to appear as normal as possible. So he was not allowed to reveal his prostheses. He had to participate in sport and seem quite normal, and that would have been quite stressful to do, to conceal the fact that actually he did have a disability.
I understand, but we go for. I'm sure that children growing up with disabilities will be anxious, may be anxious. But let's go further. You're saying that this person suffered from a disorder at the age 40 and suppressed it. And I'm saying, well, how would a minor be able to suppress it? He's coping well.
Because he was always encouraged to be as normal as possible. What I'm saying is that I have diagnosed the accused as having a general anxiety disorder now. It is likely that he has suffered this for many years, and that the factors I've brought out in my report are the factors that would have contributed to the development of this anxiety disorder. He did not know before now that he had this diagnosis. He would have known that he was anxious, but he didn't know that he had actually a treatable condition.
You see, Doctor, I'm just using your report. You said at page 8, Mr. Pistorius has a long history of generalized anxiety disorder that appears to have been increasing with time. It's likely to have commenced at the age of 11 when he was hospitalized and so forth. So if I read that, it existed at 11 months and got worse with time. Have I read it wrongly?
Perhaps I've expressed it wrongly, my ladyship.
Yes.
The anxiety disorder is something that has developed over time, and that the factors that should be taken into account in making such diagnosis would have commenced at the age of 11 months when he had the bilateral below-knee amputation.
No, then we understand each other. As it's
I apologise for that.
As it's here,
Lack
that
of
doesn't make
understanding.
sense. Yes. Good. Now, the other aspect that I want to deal with is if the accused was able to, at age 14, let's use age 14 because that's one of the paragraphs that you have mentioned in your report, he was able at age 14 to cope with his anxiety disorder and conceal it, how is it getting worse if he's coping with it and he's concealing it? If you conceal it, you cope with it, why would it get worse?
As his stresses increased, so his anxiety would have increased.
So during matric, he would have been more anxious.
If he wrote matric exams, it would have been an anxiety-provoking situation, certainly.
Now, I'm just going through a report that you said that the accused was traumatized by his mother's death. Any child losing a mother would be traumatized by that event.
That is correct.
And every child losing a mother would be anxious, having lost his mother.
That is correct.
So that in itself is not a significant issue. Although it's a factor, but it's not uncommon.
It's not uncommon, no.
Now, the other things in your report where you indicate that at a stage that he would see his extended family members more infrequently, but would see his sister more frequently. People growing up, going to race at school, that is what happens to them, isn't it? That's common.
Yes, they certainly have less contact with extended family members, but they still have their primary attachment figure. And if your mother is your primary attachment figure, you maintain that primary attachment figure lifelong, essentially until the death of your mother. So people in their 60s and 70s, when their mother dies, it's still a stressful event.
Yeah.
It's not just, shall we say, callously another funeral.
No.
So the importance of attachment figures can't be underestimated.
No.
And in Mr. Pistorius' instance, it appears that his primary attachment figure was his mother. And she died while he was a teenager, and that would have been quite stressful because he would have needed her at that stage to support him emotionally as he went through adolescence, as he was in high school, perhaps as he was developing his international career. And so she wasn't there. So,
I understand that, and in terms of a factor to be taken into account, that certainly exists, but it's not extraordinary. It happens to lots of people.
It is a factor to be taken into account, is correct. It's not an extraordinary event for people to lose their mothers.
Now, but he lost his mother and he was still coping at school.
Still passed at school.
Still did well.
He still did well. He spent time with his maternal aunt, where he saw his sister. Just had contact with her, and his brother was at school with him. So he did cope.
You see, because that brings me to the next question, and that is that at the time and from there on, that his mother's death, that stress was a very high, big stressor for him.
Yes.
Would have been very difficult to conceal his GAD after that.
Well, had he been seen by a mental health professional, they might have made the diagnosis at that stage. I don't know.
Yeah.
Because he's concealing his his anxiety is what people do. They conceal their anxiety. They conceal their vulnerabilities. And so individuals with generalized anxiety disorder, and remember this is a disorder that develops over time, the individuals don't necessarily have a diagnosis early and get put on treatment early.
No, that is so.
It's kind of something which is actually the diagnosis made quite late.
Do you have a strange smell?
I do. Something is burning.
I don't. There's definitely a strange smell. But I rather think it could be dust that they're spraying water on. May I ask the orderly just to investigate this particular matter?
Is it inside, outside?
Right, it's coming in from that side.
From outside.
But it's outside. It could also be the aircon. I just saw that the witness also smelled it. Are you comfortable, Dr. Vorster?
Yes, thank you, my lady.
Now,
Okay.
it's confirmed, my lady, it's dust. We're smelling dust.
Thank you. Thank you. We may proceed.
Yes, that's the court business. Doctor, let us just, let us deal with the high levels of crime in South Africa. Now, the accused would not be the only person that's anxious about the high levels of violent crime in South Africa. That's common.
It's common emotion, yes.
Now, you elevated the anxiety of the accused to that of a disorder. Why? You've said what one should take into account, but what specifically did you use?
Clinically, he presents with an anxiety disorder. So when one has him in front of you and doing a mental state evaluation, he appears to have an anxiety disorder. If one is then taking regard of the history as he provides, then you can see the symptoms of the anxiety disorder. And then the collateral information obtained by family members and his manager and his coach confirm his history of the anxiety disorder. So the diagnosis is made on the history, clinical presentation, and the collateral information.
Can I just ask you then, the timing of this particular report? A person that's an accused in a High Court matter, that is given evidence, that must be anxious, and that's the first time that you've seen him.
Yes.
Would that have played a role? Would that be a factor?
No.
Why would you say no? Certainly.
Because most individuals seeing a psychiatrist for evaluation will be a little bit anxious. But the history, collateral information, and clinical presentation were all indicative of a generalized anxiety disorder, not just an individual who is A, anxious about being evaluated, or B, depressed about being the accused in a matter.
But at least you would expect a person that's involved in a murder matter, that's given evidence in court, has been cross-examined, to be more anxious than a person that would just go to a psychiatrist for evaluation.
Yes, certainly.
And isn't that what was presented?
No.
Can I ask you, clinically, did he have a global dysfunctioning because of anxiety?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
In all spheres of life. But socially he was coping.
Well, superficially he was coping socially. I think if one looks at the history, he describes himself as being a lonely person. He had friends from his childhood and school that he maintained contacts with, and that would be a normal social functioning. But his other friends, his newer friends, were friends that he had perhaps to avoid being lonely. These were not people that he could confide in. He was simply in their company so as not to feel alone. His sexual relationships also appear to have been quite short in duration. So if one had to take him as, would one say he had a healthy social functioning, one would say no. But did he function socially? Yes, he did. But not optimally and not adequately.
Well, you see, but again, I know that is what you took into account, but the mere fact that young men would not make friends or would have various relationships is common. Would you not agree?
Yes, because generalized anxiety disorder is common and anxiety states are common. So many young men don't make friends because they're anxious.
But it's not common that people would shoot and kill someone in their homes. That's not common.
No. That's not at all common.
And that is what we're dealing with here. And
that is certainly what we're dealing with.
And you're saying that the GAD played a role?
I am bringing it as a factor to the court's attention that the accused has a diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder. It may have played a role, and that would be for the court to decide on the facts of the case.
Now, let us just deal with this. Yesterday you indicated that the GAD was definitely relevant to his defense.
It would be relevant if the court finds that he shot at what he presumed was an intruder. If the court finds that he deliberately shot Ms. Steenkamp, then it doesn't play a role, other than perhaps subsequently in sentencing.
Now, in your interaction with the accused, you indicated yesterday that he said he had no intention of shooting Ms. Steenkamp.
That is what he told me.
But he had intention to shoot an intruder.
Well, I would say that is probably for the court to find as a legal a legal discussion. What he told me was that he thought there was an intruder. He certainly armed himself and walked towards that danger.
And
he certainly fired shots.
Why?
At the noise, as he was scared. Is his version to me.
And you said he said to you he fired at the noise.
At the noise.
Fired 4 times at the noise.
he didn't specifically say how many times he shot, but we know that he fired 4 times.
You know that he said in court that he denied that he fired at the noise.
I don't
I
know what he
didn't
said
get
in
that.
court.
He denied that he fired at the noise. But let us just get to that. If he said to you, I was scared and I fired at the noise, that's a factor you took into account.
Yes.
Now, if I tell you now that in court he never said that he fired at the noise, there must be red lights flickering for you as far as his version is concerned.
It would appear that there are inconsistencies,
Yes.
certainly.
And also, as far as your evaluation is concerned of what happened at the time of the incident and his mental capacity, or let's not use the word capacity, let's use the word state, that will be affected by his version having changed.
It doesn't affect the fact that he has the diagnosis of a generalized anxiety disorder. But it is for the court to find, on the facts of the case, whether this was of relevance at the time of the shooting.
No, that I know, but my question was a bit different. My question was, you made certain findings for yourself based on his version to you.
Yes.
Now, that must change if his version to this court was something different.
No, it doesn't. It's
Not in
still-
terms of diagnosis, but in terms of action.
No, it doesn't change because he's still describes having been extremely frightened by the threat. So the fear of the threat and the generalized anxiety disorder would go together. So whether he remembered firing or firing at the shot may be a little difficult to have actually remembered so clearly at the time of being so frightened.
It's interesting that you would use the word remember, because I haven't. All I said is he never said he fired at the noise. Where did you pick up that he couldn't remember?
No, if he fired at the noise, or if he just fired maybe randomly, or maybe in the room, I wouldn't be that concerned in terms of his mental state because of his generalized anxiety disorder and because of his version that he was afraid at the time.
But the question was, you used the word if he couldn't remember having fired. And I'm just asking, why would you say that?
Because I wouldn't expect him to remember absolutely with crystal clarity what happened at the time if he had a generalized anxiety disorder and a trigger of fear of an intruder.
But he said to you he fired at the noise.
Yes.
And I said to you that he never said that to the court. And you said if he couldn't remember, you would expect him not to be able to remember. I'm asking you, where did you get that version that he didn't remember?
No, I'm simply saying one wouldn't expect him to remember.
But to you he said he fired at the noise.
Yes.
And I said to you that he never said that to the court.
Yes.
And you said, well, then there's
An inconsistency.
an inconsistency.
Which could be explained on the basis that as a psychiatrist, being faced with an individual with generalized anxiety disorder in a fear situation, I wouldn't expect him to remember each and every detail.
Except if he's been through cross-examination, it could be another explanation, that he was just lying.
Yeah, he could just be lying too. It's another explanation.
Yeah. I'm nearing the end of cross-examination, but I would need 5 or so minutes with the people next to me. I think it's 11:15. To adjourn for 5 minutes and then adjourn again for tea, I think would be perhaps a waste of court time. Can I ask for an early tea adjournment? And when we get back, we can sit through.
So that would be how long?
Excuse
That would be how long?
That would be, my lady, I see it's now 10 to 11. Should we be back at 11:15?
Court will adjourn.